Welcome to Influenced, a book lovers podcast hosted by book besties Tegan and Amanda.
Here at Influenced, we cover books we've been influenced to read, thanks to the internet, as well as books that have influenced us.
This podcast will talk about books ranging in age demographics, including adult content. Plus, we've been known to swear a time or two, so keep that in mind in case you have others around you. With that said, we're happy you're here.
We were influenced to read Nettle Bone by Kingfisher, which was released in 2022 by Tor Books. The audiobook is 9 hours and 3 minutes at normal speed. Originally, Nettle Bone was a short story that was posted on the author's website and then in an anthology. She still wasn't done with the characters or the ideas of this book, so she eventually wrote Nettle Bone.
The idea for this story came to her at random in a grocery store parking lot, particularly the idea of the cloak of Nettle and the dog made of bones. In the author's note, she said, authors have minds like pack rats, and a lot of stuff gets squirreled away, some of which belongs to other people. And I thought that was a really good reminder of how cool it would be to spend a day inside an author's head, just with all of the thoughts that they have going, just bouncing around in their heads all day.
I can't even imagine. As somebody that works in the creative field, I've always wanted to write a book, but I do not have the headspace or the ability to write. And trying to take a jumble of ideas that are running around your head and put them into a coherent thought. I just props to authors, because that's a very hard feat.
So if you haven't read Nettle Bone yet, no worries. We will start with a spoiler-free overview and give you a fair warning before we get into too much detail.
Nettle Bone is a fantasy dark fairy tale, and the story follows Mara, who is the third princess of the Harbor Kingdom. The kingdom's relationship with the northern and southern kingdoms is very precarious. After the death of her oldest sister, who was married to the Northern Kingdom prince, her other sister, Kania, marries Prince Vorling in order to keep those ties secure. But once she learns of the abuse her sister suffers at the hands of her husband, Mara goes on a quest to kill a prince and save her sister. Along the way, she makes new friendships and allies that prove valuable and precious. This book is written in a third-person point of view, with some of Mara's thoughts being interwoven with first-person perspective.
And now it's time to give our star ratings of Nettle Bone. How do we rate our reads? It's great you asked. We both have a similar star format. 5 stars, it was a perfect book. 4 stars, nearly perfect. 3 stars, it was good. 2, it was a bad book that we really didn't enjoy. And finally, you'll probably never hear a 1 star on here, because most likely, if we rated it that low, we DNF'd it. So I'll kick us off here. I rated this book 2 stars. I did not enjoy it, and I don't think it lives up to the hype that it's gotten. This book won the Hugo Award for Best Novel in 2023. It was also a nominee for several other awards, so I was very excited to read it. I had really high hopes. Ultimately, it fell flat, and I'm asking myself if I really read the same book as everyone else.
All I can do is agree with you there, Tegan. I gave this 1.5 stars. If it wasn't for this podcast, and I'm assuming you think the same way about this, I don't think either one of us probably would have finished this book.
I probably would have put it down and tried to come back to it in a few months, but I'm not sure that I would have enjoyed it anymore.
I also don't understand the hype and the accolades for this. I'm glad that some readers can relate to this book and love this book, and that the accolades it has won, I'm not saying they aren't deserving. It's like you said, I'm not sure if I'm reading the same book as what won all of these awards. To me, it was just 240 pages of complete underdevelopment.
I could not connect with any of the characters. I didn't really like them, and I felt like there was no character development.
And a lack of world building altogether. We'll dive in a little bit more here in a few with our spoiler section, but there were several pieces, particularly in the beginning of the book, that were brought up that were a mention of this world and some problems going on, and then never once brought up again. And maybe it was meant to be context, but they felt like they were going to be important pieces of information that ultimately were never that important.
I'm curious what your thoughts are there because I didn't pick up on that. I don't know how engaged I was with this book.
And maybe I'm an exposition snob. We read so many great fantasy books out there that have these worlds that are complex, well developed, and know when to bring important elements and when to skim over things. And I just don't feel like this book balanced that very well.
But for our friends who did enjoy this book, or even for those who didn't and want something else that they might like more, some similar reading recommendations we have for you are Uprooted or Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. Personally, I hated Uprooted, but Spinning Silver was pretty good. And also, the internet recommends other books by T. Kingfisher or anything by Terry Pratchett if you did enjoy this book.
Now we're in the part of our journey together where we are going to do more of a deep dive into the story. So this is your spoiler warning. If you have not read Nettle and Bone, now is your time to stop listening if you don't want the ending spoiled. But if you don't mind spoilers, then by all means join us further. Now, this book was only 240-ish pages, so we are going to focus on just our main character here, Mara, for our exercise, which is the characters in 3 words. And Tegan, I'm curious, since we both hated this book so much, what you had to say about Mara.
Loyal, determined, and naive.
I put caring, sheltered, and innocent.
Oh, sheltered is a really good word. I wasn't confident about my naive word. I was just trying to think of a word that portrays that she has very little life experience and doesn't have a good understanding of people or their motives and intentions.
With a 1.5 and 2-star rating, I think it's safe to assume that a lot of our discussion here may not be so positive. And I do apologize for that. So we should probably start with what, Tegan, did we like out of this book?
I appreciated that it was an original fairy tale rather than a retelling. Now, I don't think it was executed very well, but what it would have taken for the author to come up with an original fairy tale and put all of those ideas out there, I'm sure was very hard work, required a lot of creative process, and I just want to accolade that.
That goes along with what we touched on earlier, where in an author's head, there's all these ideas jumbling around and you have a concept, but getting it onto paper is a much harder task. And we say this as people that probably will never write a book in their life, nor if we tried, would it be probably a successful book at all.
I also really liked the demon chicken. Like, a chicken possessed by a demon was a really funny element that I was not expecting to read.
Anything with Bone Dog was my favorite as well. I cannot remember which Tim Burton movie it is off the top of my head, but I'm picturing a bone dog. Like this long-snouted dog that's dead and it's in bones, and I can't remember if it's like The Corpse Bride or Nightmare Before Christmas or which one it is, but that's all I could picture throughout this book, and I really did enjoy any moment with that.
I'm not familiar with that, but I'm going to look it up.
I also really enjoyed the concept of one sister, particularly the younger sister, wanting to save her other one from a terrible husband and a very likely death. Plus, cranky godmothers. That was also a very fun element that I think was a saving grace for this book.
By the way, it was The Corpse Bride.
It was The Corpse Bride. I just knew I had seen a bone dog somewhere, and it was really cute. And I kept picturing The Corpse Bride bone dog every time I was reading that book. Keeping the positive note, who was your favorite character? Not that we had that many characters in this book.
Mine was a tie between Fenris and Bone Dog because Bone Dog is, as you said, super cute. And Fenris, I thought actually had some funny lines in the book.
This is how forgettable this book was to me. I cannot picture off the top of my head any funny lines coming from that man.
There was some humor sprinkled in there. I don't remember specific quotes off the top of my head, but they were there.
In terms of human characters, the Dust Wife I felt like was very fun. She had that grumpy demeanor, and to me she was the only human character that kept me going through this book. But everyone else that was on these pages, I just felt like they fell flat, were very two-dimensional, not very exciting, and didn't have very much, if at all, growth.
I'm curious, did this book remind you of any other fairy tales or other stories while you were reading?
There were a few that stood out to me. The first one, immediately off the top of my head when I was reading this book, was the Demon Pinocchio, where you have this marionette puppet thing that is strangling its owner, and that was a little too far for me. I don't do dolls. I don't do marionettes. I never liked Pinocchio, even the movie, growing up because it scared the shit out of me, because I don't do those things.
That reminded you of Pinocchio?
Yes. Just this, like,
That's hilarious.
doll marionette thing that wants to be real and just is creepy as all get out. I will never not see Demon Pinocchio.
Wasn't there also like a little marionette puppet show thing in Dumbo?
I've never seen Dumbo.
Am I making that up? You've never seen Dumbo?
I've never seen Dumbo.
Okay. All right. Well, you said there were a couple other stories this reminded you of. So, other than Pinocchio, what did it make you think of?
I also got some Rumpelstiltskin vibes with the nettle weaving. In the original Rumpelstiltskin storytelling, the main character has to weave straw into gold, and Rumpelstiltskin comes in and does that for her. And even though it's not there completely, just the concept of the nettle weaving, something that should be physically impossible to do, but still gets done anyway. Just that kind of concept there. And then lastly, I got a Sleeping Beauty vibe. In Sleeping Beauty, the godmothers play a sort of protection role to the child, and Agnes and the Dust Wife made me think of the fairy godmothers from Sleeping Beauty.
So, for me, I actually picked up on a lot of Alice in Wonderland similarities, especially at the beginning when she was starting her quest.
I hadn't even considered Alice in Wonderland, but now that you say it, I can see where that's coming from.
And I'm not as familiar with this reference, but when I was looking at other reviews online, I saw someone say that this book was like Lord of the Rings meets Alice in Wonderland. And I don't have the context there to really understand if that's accurate. It was something like comparing the characters on this quest and assigning them like sort of like D&D roles.
I'm familiar, but not nearly enough familiar with Lord of the Rings, besides what I have watched at least once a month when my husband puts it on the TV. I think the concept is you have these very different, unique individuals coming together for a common quest and goal, so maybe that's where they're coming from.
Yeah, maybe so.
Nettle and Bone is technically classified as a horror / dark fantasy genre, but does that fit this book? I have reservations that that is the correct genre classification for this book.
Thematically, yes. And I think the intent is there, but the execution of those themes fell flat. And I'm not sure where else you would put it.
I felt like the concept of horror or dark fantasy was a complete stretch. This felt more of a short form epic quest fantasy with a slightly more ominous tone, but even then, I didn't feel too much horror or ominous presence, and there was very little gore and scary scenes to it. Besides Demon Pinocchio, that was the one spot that I just couldn't do, and I have too vivid of an imagination for that scene. But beyond Demon Pinocchio, I never once would have thought that this would have been classified as a horror or dark fantasy. And maybe that says enough to us that we read enough fucked up shit in our daily reading lives that this didn't feel that dark.
Now that you clarified that, yeah, I totally see that. I agree with you there. Especially since there's a lot of intended humor sprinkled throughout this book.
Yeah, I feel like there was a lot of lightheartedness, upbeatness, positivity weaved in more often for something that has a very sad and ominous concept with a shitty husband, potential death, saving a sister. There was just this mismatch that didn't jive together.
Do you have any thoughts on what would have made the book better?
Oh, I have so many thoughts, Tegan.
I thought you might.
I'm one of those people that tends to see the good in all the concepts because I think any concept could be a good book. It could be the weirdest concept in your mind, but if you can execute it well, it can be a good book. So, I have 3 things that I think would have made this book better. First is more information. There was a lot of underdevelopment and things that were dropped in that I mentioned before that are not discussed later on. For example, the Dust Wife is the weapon. She completes these tasks and the Dust Wife tells her, "I'm your weapon." But why? Why are you the weapon? We're just going to blindly trust her with no plan? We get halfway through this book before we even start talking about a plan to kill this prince. And there's a lot of world mentions that are brought up in the beginning and not mentioned again, such as cannibals, a blighted land that is expanding apparently, but it was never addressed again. Like, what the fuck? I was very curious as to what was happening there, and then I just got left on red, wanting to know what is going on there.
I agree that there needs to be more information. That was something I put down in my notes too. I think this book really would have been better if it had been about 50 to 100 pages longer and included more world building and more background. As you mentioned, a lot of the things were said but then never explained and didn't come up later. As I was reading this, I felt like the author wrote it as though the reader was already familiar with the world, and I needed more explanation.
Yes. You know, even if you are familiar with the world, like let's say it's a sequel or the 3rd or 4th or 5th book in a series, even if you are well established with the world, usually the author will always still provide some sort of clarity and explanation in case it's been a while since you've been introduced to that world. Or if it is a spin-off of the world that you don't need to read this book that you currently are. And that just doesn't happen here in a way that was digestible and easy to understand. Secondly, I wanted better characters in this book. I mentioned that everyone was two-dimensional, flat, not very exciting. I know you said he was one of your favorite characters, but Fenris was irritating and almost too loyal, and not in a golden retriever kind of way. The guy was ready to just go lay himself on the sword for his honor and be incredibly loyal, not question anything. And I just thought that that was just very two-dimensional and could have been developed a little further. Same with Mara. Mara was very bland and too naive to not ask any questions, to have a plan ready to go kill this prince, to do any sort of exploration or information gathering to best execute her plan. I just felt like her characterization lacked the motivations to follow through with what she was trying to do and what her goal was.
I do think on Mara that her character was intentionally written as like a very determined idiot. Like, her strength was her determination, not her brain power. My big problem with Mara is that she is stated to be 30 years old, but reading her character felt like it was a teenager.
Yes. You know, you read a lot of books, especially fantasy books, that are almost the opposite. They are 19, 20-year-old characters that read upper 20s, early 30s. And this was the opposite of that. Lastly, if I was an editor, and I'm not, this is how I would picture this book being better and more successful. Typically, books are written in 3 acts. Movies are the same way. And this is how I would picture those 3 acts going in this book, which would require more pages to be successful. The first act would be Mara going and trying to finish these 3 impossible tasks, especially the clay jar with the moon grabbing. That would have been really cool to see, and we just got breezed over that in 2 sentences. But as she's doing these impossible tasks, she would be making those relationships along the way. Then we would move into the second act. And in the second act, she would make it to the palace and be the doting sister. But while she's there, she'd be gathering intelligence, making a plan, figuring out the best methods to assassinate a prince, and using the people that she has brought with her to execute this plan, which would then culminate in the third act with her killing Vorling and figuring out how to get out of the consequences. That was something that I have an issue with the end of this book. It skimmed through the consequences of her killing this prince, even though she didn't do it, she helped plan it. These consequences were just kind of scraped by real fast, and here's the ending of the book, and the end, all done. And I would have loved a whole act of that. So, that is my 3 acts that I think would have made this book better. Again, it would require probably another 100, 150 pages, but it would give you more development, a more cohesive storyline, better execution, I think.
You mentioned the ending of the book, and I felt like that was very tropey and predictable, with the queen rising in power and then the person, Fenris, who actually murdered the prince, like being, fake punished just for show, and then faking his death and then being saved in the end, and then they get to just gallop off together and live under the radar. Just felt like a lazy way to sum it up, and like you said, no consequences.
And maybe we're being overly critical, and that's not the point of this book. It's supposed to be something quick and easy to read, but again, maybe I'm a snob. I don't think that that is good storytelling, and that leaves your readers wanting more than enjoying what they get. Now, I would say, though, we're in the minority, Tegan. The internet doesn't feel this way that we do. If you go on to Goodreads, this book has a 4.14 star rating on average, with a lot of 5-star reviews. And I think we've gathered a few to help balance out the things that we had to say.
Yes. So the first one comes from John Hamm, who said, Nettle and Bone is a wonderful adult fairy tale where a third-born princess takes serious matters into her own hands. Along the way, she picks up allies that normally might be only seen in glimpses of other fairy tales. T. Kingfisher does a great job of fleshing out details of the story while still progressing the book at a good pace.
One of the 5-star reviews I found came from Karen, and an excerpt of that would be, "It's a perfect story, perfectly told. I am so in love with Kingfisher's fertile imagination and nuanced character work. The quiet lines she just tosses out that mean so much more than they seem to at first glance. How nothing is ever black and white, and the care she takes in managing the gray, even her dang author's notes are fun."
The next one comes from Hannah Gordon. Okay, I really liked this book despite pausing halfway through and not reading for like 2 weeks. Rambling thoughts. 1. Normalize female fantasy protagonists being older than 19, for the love of God. Us almost 30-year-olds need more 30-year-old MCs. 2. This cast of characters is so fun. A princess turned almost nun, a dust wife, a demon-possessed chicken, a very honorable murderer, a not-so-evil godmother, a dog made of bones, and a teeny tiny chicken. 3. I'm all for more books about princesses murdering princes. 4. I'm also all for more books about sisters protecting each other. And 5. I want a bone dog. Although I did not like this particular book, I agree with all of the sentiments expressed.
But I would say there are lots of books. Maybe not the age thing, because I think that is a very valid point. But the killing princes, sisters protecting sisters, guys, there's some other books out there that have that and will give you a better story and a better world. But to validate our not so positive opinions of this book, we did pull at least one low star review for us to talk about. Mine comes from Neha, and it starts, quote, "This isn't the kind of fairy tale where the princess marries a prince. It's the one where she kills him," end quote. That tagline led me to expect a much more interesting story and a counter-narrative to the fairy tale culture than I got. This is allegedly a dark fairy tale with horror mixed in, but despite touching on some heavy topics in a very surface-level way, it actually ends up reading pretty fluffy.
Very well put, Neha. Yes. I agree with all of that.
She summed up my thoughts very perfectly.
Mine came from Lauren's Little Library. Because of the blurb, I expected so much more than what this gave. While I'm not mad I finished it, and while it wasn't bad, looking back, I can admit that I probably should have DNF'd this because it was so mediocre.
I felt terrible, but it was a chore to get through.
It really was. It's a 240-page book, and it took me almost a week to read.
I really had to push myself to get through it. Maybe part of it is because I had to stop a really good book that I was reading to start Nettle and Bone, and the whole time my mind was thinking, I want to get back to this other book. But if it's a good book, I feel like I would stay engaged, and I couldn't do it. But if you look at Goodreads, less than 1% gave this book 1 star. So obviously we went wrong somewhere, and we are in the minority. And if you like weird, quirky, quest-type fantasy with a fairy tale spin, I do think you'll enjoy this book. So if you haven't read it and you've gotten this far, give it a try. Maybe we're wrong.
That's all we have for our discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us. We would love to hear your thoughts on Nettle and Bone, especially if you disliked it as much as we did. And if you'd like to connect with us, please consider following us on TikTok and Instagram with the handle @InfluenceBookPodcast on both platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate us wherever you get your podcasts.
We look forward to our next episode when we will be discussing None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. Until next time, happy reading!